Hi, Anna. Welcome to Not Just Ads. I usually jokingly tell you that you are a polymath. Okay, in general, I see you on digital advertising and digital media environments, but you do much more. What are the areas that you touch with your business?
Hi, Alessandro. I focus on transformation and the areas that I lovingly call the in between. And this is partially intentional and partially kind of how my career has evolved. And I always found those places right between functional areas and strict definitions the most interesting ones and where a lot of really cool and innovative things happen. So I'm a computer scientist by trade, but I've gravitated towards product and strategy leadership roles, mainly around media entertainment, advertising technology, and data. And those were always the kind of the first in between roles. So when you look at my skill set, it's very, to your point, very polymathy, very end to end sort of. So I think I'm the perfect advisor and strategic consultant, which just happens to be what I do for a day job right now. So I think
And the
it
perfect
worked really well. Yeah.
And the perfect guest for a video podcast called Not Just Ads. In fact,
Exactly.
I don't want to talk about ads today. I want to talk about innovation.
Sorry,
What
everyone
is
who's here to talk about advertising. We're just steamrolling in a different direction.
sports?
Ah.
I always thought that it's not me discovering it, but there is a religious like engagement between audiences and athletes and clubs,
Mhm.
leagues, and also all these organizations, and I include athletes also, are increasingly investing in becoming media owners.
Mhm.
How is technology supporting engagement with fandom? Generic question
Oh,
first.
that is such there's so much to unpack here. And it's interesting because when you look at it from a transformation perspective, you kind of have to look at the new commercial opportunities that athletes have at different levels now. If you look at the US media environment in general, we've recently gotten the ability for college athletes to monetize their likeness. These are nil deals. This was not something that was possible before. So this now opens up an entirely new universe of monetization opportunities. And the question then becomes, how do you structure those deals? How do you find them? How do you promote an athlete? How does an athlete build their followers and fandoms and like what is the structure of what that looks like? And rather than having very sports focused kinds of tools, we have very general tools like Facebook, Instagram, to a lesser extent, the former Twitter. No presence on LinkedIn usually until you're retired and on the speaker circuit if you're an athlete. But it's very exciting from because it's a new challenge. Like athletes didn't have to think about their media stack. They would, go and strike a deal with a television network. They would be a commentator. They would know exactly when to show up. Somebody would tell them what to say. They would kind of brush up what they're saying and give it their own flavor. And now they have to learn this entirely new skill set on what to post when so that they are an attractive media product. So the new media product, I should say, which is very different than how you would position somebody to be a talking head on like ESPN, for instance. And so it's really, really interesting to see how athletes from more niche sports, like think maybe surfing or a pro cycling or similar are grabbing the spotlight that was previously reserved just for global soccer superstars, or I should say football superstars, or NBA superstars. And so it's opening up so much more interesting sports related content and monetization opportunities, but they all seem to be going over the top of traditional media and entertainment setups. So, all that to say, if you're a media owner who's used to writing about your local football team or your local basketball team or similar, maybe you're not seeing that audience that you could previously rely on, because rather than going to you, they are now going directly to the athletes that they follow. They being people, fans in general.
I like the fact that you mentioned strategy first, which is always it. You can change sector, you can change technology, but that is the pillar. And in terms of specific technologies that can facilitate this bridging, this direct connection, which ones would you single out as the most interesting today?
So that's both that's both the problem and the challenge, because usually with these kinds of direct to consumer media properties, folks start by trying and then figure out or glom on a strategy later, as opposed to starting with a strategy, thinking of yourself as a brand, understanding who your key audience would be, and moving in that direction. So I think for most folks who are starting to be considered media themselves, it's most likely some mix of an Instagram presence, perhaps to a lesser extent original Facebook presence, and increasingly YouTube and podcasts, because these are things that athletes themselves can produce and own. And when I say athletes, and I really mean any individual with an interesting angle, interesting story. We've seen such a rise in, B2B influencer markets in the last couple of years, and B2B personalities that have leveraged social channels in particular to build these followings that are, now rivaling, if not have already eclipsed, the MSNBCs of the world and Bloomberg TV talking heads. And I say talking heads lovingly. I think that's a passe model from where we are today.
Right now,
Uh,
we are to talk. Technically speaking, two talking heads. Two.
oh no. Well, there goes my
In this,
thesis.
I mean, in this very moment.
In this very moment, indeed, but we are talking heads going over the top. In addition to kind of glomming on strategy later, it's not easy to think about all of the, like, what are all the things that you need in your media stack if you don't have a lot of media training, media exposure. And so you might not even be aware that there should be, different approaches to, let's say, building your email list, if that's even important for you, or how to approach your follower building. So it's not an easy answer to say here's what you'll need. I do wish there were more topical agencies and experts focused on, let's say, young athletes just breaking out, to kind of give them guidance on what the different commercialization options would be given the number of followers they have, the reach they have, and similar things. Because this data is absolutely being used on the other end by pro teams to evaluate who they want to draft, who they want to invest in, who they want on their roster. And over the past decade or so, the differences between somebody who has a huge organic or seemingly organic following and can amplify a team's voice, a brand's voice, have been decisive criteria, especially earlier on in careers, on who gets which offer. So that I hope that process becomes easier in the coming years, as we retool and reconfigure the media environment.
I agree, and you mentioned young athletes, but
Mm-hmm.
I'm also thinking of strategies for athletes that plan after retirement how to remain engaged with their audiences that are still there
Yeah. So
without
so I'm a
disappearing.
I'm a tennis player, and it's an interesting year for tennis because we are witnessing the slow, gradual transition of the previously three most dominant tennis players in the history of tennis. Two have now retired, and Novak Djokovic is still in there, still fighting, and still just an unbelievable career. So when I think about the options that someone of that stature has globally, the kind of interesting commercial deals they can do, but also the just the amount of influence they have in very different markets is such a delicious challenge to consider. And yeah, to your point, like we're starting to see folks who would have normally just kind of sailed off into the sunset, or stricken a deal or two here or there to show up and be a commentator occasionally, really start to think about these post-career brands and post-career commercial opportunities that extend beyond just being a spokesperson for a tier one brand. It's a very interesting time to see that. And I think it's also interesting because I would hope that like sports agents are folks who are thinking about how should we structure the stack for folks in our portfolio. um uh, and they're the ones who seem like the best bridge between commercial considerations and an individual media property. And again, athletes are a proxy for just about anybody in this space. I think it's also interesting to see when senior executives or um, uh, politicians enter the post-retirement speaker circuit or similar, and they have very similar approaches to building the fandoms and the spheres of influence around them, that would apply to just about anybody who wants to be a media property.
I was last week at an event and there was a presentation about virtual worlds and
Mm.
the figures in engagement. You see, if you have the three buckets, traditional media, social media, and virtual worlds, it's mind blowing. The kind of difference of engagement, virtual worlds literally dwarf social media.
Yeah, I think the engagement levels are better in environments where engagement feels natural. And this is more, I think, a testament to traditional media's lack of paying attention to overall customer experience and creating these environments that look really strange on desktop, but when you're consuming content on your mobile phone, which is about this far away from your face, the punchable distance, as I like to call it, it's even more jarring if you're trying to read an article and the video player pops out at you and there's like seven different ads floating around the itty bitty part of text that you're trying to read. And then that's just not a good experience for anyone. So naturally, consumers, given an option, will start to gravitate towards environments that seem less incongruous. And that is for unfortunately perhaps social media, because at least content there looks more put together, even though it could be uh, much lower quality, lower veracity, more misinformation there than in traditional media. And then let's just call it the multiverse group of experiences that are by nature more immersive. So I think we're right in that in between stage when we can start seeing some really interesting implementations of AR and how we interact with the space around us through our mobile phones or through other specialist devices like the Meta glasses and similar artifacts. I'm going to stop one stop short of the VR headsets. I think they are very useful when you're on a very, very long flight in a very cramped seat and you just want to be literally anywhere else than where you physically are. I think that's the use case. But I don't think they're at the price point yet where we can really think of them as a true consumer device, versus these other tools are either already available or at a much lower price point, so they seem like the natural next step for a lot of people. So when I talk to brands about this is the area that's particularly exciting, because you can really see new opportunities to promote yourself outside of the previously very regimented, this sized box ad and this sized box ad and this shape box ad that goes around some content. And I think this is much more a much better experience for consumers as well. So the virtual try-ons come into play here, or the ability to see an item in your space before you purchase it, for example. These are very lightweight uses of AR that I think are hugely beneficial to the end consumer, and also open up an entire new world of possibilities for brands to think about how they position themselves.
Not talking about the future and the experimentation, the innovation. I have seen, talking, staying on the sports industry, the NBA really using AI to produce their content, their highlights, for example, thousands of different versions in few minutes. And I think that is probably something less inspirational, but much closer, an example of what technology can today actually bring in the day to day already of media owners.
It's a really interesting use case, and I know in the U.S. There have been a couple of controversial examples where, what was formerly like a single reporter that would, usually in a local media kind of scenario, go to like all the local games, write up a little summary of who did what, and then publish it. That only allowed for a certain amount of coverage. So it meant that if you were in a small town somewhere in the Midwest, maybe the football games of the top three high schools were getting covered, but no other sport was. And so when you, as a media owner, when you think about the ability of scaling your coverage and providing at least some kind of insight into an audience that's maybe interested in hockey or lacrosse, or the sports that would not command that tier one treatment from a media organization, this is where I think AI comes into play, or generative AI comes into play really, really well. And yeah, I think, for someone like the NBA who has so much content to source from, it's really interesting to see them experiment with different lengths, different formats, different channels for redistribution. Because for the longest time it was just, oh, here you have broadcast rights. I don't really need to think about that anymore. It's kind of on autopilot, and it's very, very nice to see a tier one sports, tier one global sports innovate in such a way. And it's also much more interesting to see who can readily innovate versus who is structured in a way that's making that kind of innovation harder. And this goes back to, who owns a league, or how is a league structured? Are individual clubs owned by individual people? Is their data in some sort, is it readily combinable with other data sets, their customer data? Do they even have data on anybody who is not a season ticket holder, for example, and similar. So I don't want to go into a very sports heavy tangent, but it's such a good example because they cut across the traditional media environment. They are obviously their prime customers are very much in this current and future moment of being able to go direct to the team, the athlete, the player, whoever. And so that seeing them navigate this is a really interesting set of use cases.
This is actually a very, very good point, and is not so detached from media and advertising. I'm a big fan of media alliances, of media owners working together. You mentioned the US leagues, and the US leagues have such a consistent approach from the league perspective on technology, on marketing, on digital. And I see the difference with European leagues, where most of the cases, the individual clubs will go their own way, their own separate way. And I can see the future being not so close because of the slowing down of different speeds within the same league.
And it's an issue of survival because there's only so many hours in a day. And so consumers, where they would previously only be interested in football, soccer, or basketball, or like the big sports, if they're getting a better experience from what you would consider a niche sport now, then they will gravitate towards that niche sport and orient their fandom interests towards that niche sport. So it's not an optional adaptation. It's coming for everyone. And to your point, I think some leagues have an easier structure that lets them approach things like customer data, and then can be better partners to brands and um, um, other types of sponsors, because they'll be able to articulate their own audiences better. And so if you look at what's happened over the last decade with Formula One, that went from a popular but very niche sport that solely relied on broadcast rights globally to now being this juggernaut of very clearly cultivated fandoms around a relatively small number of professional drivers, team personalities, etc. But the strategy that was deployed that spanned content development via the Netflix Drive to Survive series, for example, timing that with launching new tracks, new consumer offerings, and then the focus of each of the drivers and personalities on building their own audiences. It's really wonderful to see something like that, and it's almost easier for sports that are challenger sports to do that than it is for someone like tennis to adapt everything about how they're going to market today to be able to take advantage of more direct to consumer relationships, which in tennis's example, you see a clear challenger that's literally coming for tennis in pickleball, which, oh my god, I hate that name. I can't believe every time I'm saying it that it's like an actual serious sport that people are following. But they are approaching the space from such a structured audience building way that it's easy to see how they might convert lifelong fans into pickleball. Somebody please rename that thing before it becomes a bigger thing. It's driving me
and
nuts.
and uh, and I know how related this is, but while you were talking earlier, I got this thought in my head. Tony Hawk, a skateboarder,
Yes.
it's a niche sport, It's
What
but
was a niche
he
sport,
built
right?
an
Yes.
empire.
Yes. And that was one of the first examples of really clever use of licensing with gaming and understanding the kind of the affinity of the audience, and extending it there. Soccer's done a similar thing with Madden, and like the Club Manager app, and similar, this ancillary content that exists around a sport that kind of assumes that you need to be a fan to be able to participate in the ancillary coolness. But yeah, Tony Hawk's a great example. I think the surfing is another excellent example. Again, a previously very niche sport, very amateur like, now being turned into a very, like, very methodically transformed into something that the fans can tune in and follow. It's not an easy sport to follow. It requires a lot of upfront knowledge to be able to enjoy it and understand how the scoring works. And in that sense, it's almost similar to like Formula One and automotive sports, where again, you have a lot of learning to do before you can just sit back and enjoy a race. Not that it's a very passive experience in general. Usually I'm just yelling at the TV and similar, but yeah, so there's so much opportunity, especially we're in a post Olympics year now. And whenever you have that kind of catalyzing event where there's a lot of eyeballs on particular athletes, I think track and field is prime for its superstar moment. And they do have the Diamond League, but taking that into much higher commercial stratospheres, because those are athletes are fantastically marketable. Previously, they were usually just marketable within their own markets, but there are some legitimately global superstars now because they're able to go over the top and appeal to literally anyone. And so that's interesting to watch as well.
I think it is coming across how much
Mm-hmm.
we both love sports, and
Yes.
we have been hopping around different topics. And by the way, this is by design. I always wanted this podcast to be the recording of a conversation as if we had it at the coffee shop or over lunch. And
This is
so
this is true. An exorbitantly embarrassing amount of our conversations are focused on sports, given that we are technically, neither one of us is 100% focused on this in their lives. It just, I think, tells you how connective and interesting sports as a category is, as a category of media, as a category of entertainment. So yeah.
yes, but that's a very good point you are making, because at a certain point in my career, I tried to bridge data, my experience in data and audiences, and bring them into sports. And the obstacle I found was, and we are talking about 15 years ago, but the obstacle I found was, okay, you need to be from inside the sports industry in
Yeah.
order to operate within the sports industry. You don't need to have been a player or a coach in sports management to work in the sports industry.
That is what I tell myself too. But I think yes. I'll caveat it by saying that there were parts of sports organizations that were much more receptive to these kinds of conversations, but they were usually in like the data and analytics teams, and they were the ones with budgets as well. So that was great. But what's really new now is the commercial opportunity that is now opening up for folks who are not, like, if you are Barcelona Football Club, you have no problem monetizing yourself. But if you're not, if you're like a, third tier regional club that needs a very, needs people to show up for the local matches because they are a feeder club for someone like Barcelona to develop athletes, to have them, to have a promotion path for them, and kind of a career path, then you need to have a different approach, and you need to rethink your approach. And for the first time, the way you might build that fandom is actually not prohibitively expensive. Like, you don't need to spend several $1,000,000 on a CRM, for example, or things like that. And that's what's making it really interesting. The rethinking of commercialization on top of different types of media, on top of ancillary content, and on top of content that is not licensed already and doesn't have a direct path is what's really, really attractive here. And I think from a brand perspective too, like when you think about, if you're a tier one brand, you now have a full, generation of players whom you can support. And you were mentioning Tony Hawk earlier, and that's interesting in skating. Sponsors would start sponsoring kids very early on, for, very, very little money, to eventually get a larger payoff when one of those kids turned into a global superstar. So that kind of nurturing relationship on the sponsor side, again, is also possible now. And I just think it makes it a much, much more interesting space for everybody. And now we really need to hit the stop talking about sports button, because this is not a sports podcast.
Yes, but let me add. I have something else to add to this, because it's a very, very good, another very good point you're making. You mentioned Barcelona winning, Barcelona not needing almost support, because the engagement comes naturally. But you don't need to be a third category team to have issues when you're losing. You can be on a top league and you can have a bad season. So if you
Which
don't
never
have a
happens to
strategy,
Barcelona, by the way. That has never happened in their history, but yes.
I can sense some fandom sentiment
But
here.
it's from a media owner's perspective. I think in the traditional world of media, we lack resilience, because the monetization options for the longest time have been content licensing and advertising. And those both rely on a steady supply of people consuming, interacting with the media brand. And so when that math starts to change, as it did with the slow decay of cable television and subscription, traditional linear subscription television, then all of a sudden, companies that were previously incredibly healthy, reliably healthy businesses found themselves in this unknown territory where, all of the stuff that they would normally do costs money, and the money coming in started getting smaller and smaller. And so to have the agility to be able to boost up a new line of revenue or open up new monetization opportunities, that is very difficult to execute in traditional matrix, functionally structured organizations, which is why we've seen a lot of the traditional mastheads and traditional media owners in both television, newspapers, magazines struggle over the years to not reach profitability but survive. And so it's great to look at folks who've never had that legacy problem before and how they're adapting, but it's also interesting to compare and contrast, because for someone coming in from the outside, it's very easy to recommend what needs to change, but executing on that change internally is incredibly challenging. And so we're in that. I think they all see the opportunity, but they have to manage what they have, to as well as possible.
And I think that is probably the weakest point in media monetization today. And whoever has listened to the podcast, is something is a recurrent theme that comes up every single episode. It's about alignment of objectives and incentives.
Yeah, so we started talking about innovation, which is cool and sexy, and now we're talking about like organizational transformation, which is the exact opposite of cool and sexy. And nobody really, like, these aren't projects that folks get excited about, but they are necessary because otherwise organizations won't be able to thrive. And when I say organizations, I mainly mean media owners. But when we look at the entirety of advertising, if you have weakened media owners, that doesn't create a good environment for brands either, because that relationship is incredibly symbiotic. So you can't be Rolex advertising on trash websites and my uncle's ranty blog, because that's not a good audience fit, in spite of what the digital programmatic advertising era will say about disassociating content from audience. I think we need to put some of that stuff back in the bag that we've unpacked during that era.
But look at how smooth the move to again to an innovation topic. We are talking about organization, and I've read and listened quite a bit recently about AI team members.
Mm. So this is my favorite topic. I've gone very deep on AI, practical applications of AI in organizations this year. I've developed some really interesting kind of AI roadmap like things for adoption within very large global organizations. And so there's so much nuance here. Most companies are not new to AI at all. Most brands are absolutely not to AI, not new to AI. Maybe they're new to AI in advertising, but most likely they're not new there either, because there's been some algorithmic optimization in placements that they've relied upon and similar. But the area that I think is universally super interesting for me lies somewhere between that kind of operational AI and generative AI, and it's a kind of a storyteller AI. So think about um, having an AI assistant running along with this podcast now and issuing a summary of the most interesting things of coming from our conversation right afterwards. And then think about having that kind of an additional AI team member in areas of your team where you may feel stretched. A lot of places that will very obviously tell you they need an assistant would be in the topics of business analysis, for example, because every function has a need, whether you're in sales or you're in product, or wherever you actually are. You most certainly have a need for more analysis of some kind, and you usually either don't have the know-how or don't have the bandwidth to do that yourself, or if you have a team, an internal team that's supposed to deliver that kind of insight to you, you don't have enough cycles of their time to really make it quick and worthwhile. So thinking about having an AI powered analyst is incredibly it's such a superpower, and it's something that's very attainable. There are a couple of companies that are doing this by functional area now that I'm very closely following, because that to me is the perfect implementation of a very new technology in a very instantly assistive and value add way to the people who would otherwise maybe feel threatened by it or not really know how to approach it. So that's my big area of excitement in AI right now is, synthetic team members is very Star Trekky. I feel like all of these things that we've talked about today are so connected,
Oh,
and
absolutely, absolutely.
that's part of the beauty of it, because somebody who with an advertising background listening to this might go like, why are these two yapping on about sports? Like, yes, it's cool, great, but how does that help me in my day-to-day job? And my answer is it's all connected, but not in a like okay, this woman's clearly insane kind of way, but it really is, because um,
They are.
all of these things that have been pioneered in programmatic advertising, the granularity and availability of data and signal, is now ready to be used for beyond just programmatic advertising, for business planning, for forecasting, for supply chain optimization, and all of these cool day-to-day business uses where data has traditionally been transformative. And so for someone from an advertising background, it's a first, almost the first pass at using advertising data as an input into something else, into something that is much more related to how the company actually makes money, and versus being an expense, which traditionally is how brands look at advertising. Like, we kind of, this is the cost of doing business, right? And that, I think, is such an opportunity for advertising professionals, advertising leaders, to rethink their overall value to the organization. And I know there's been a lot of talk about, oh, advertising is not just a cost center anymore, etc. But that is really what it is. And that requires us to go from being in the money, please, this is my budget, this is what you're going to give me next year, I'm going to spend it all, and we're just going to pretend like it worked, to having other ways of articulating the value of these advertising data sets. Like, now we can articulate the value of having several million people on a mailing list. If you're a brand, you know exactly what that's valued, because you can anticipate how much revenue you're going to get from that now very organic channel, which wasn't an option 10, 15, 20 years ago. You didn't need that muscle because that reality didn't exist. So
Totally.
it's all advertising, is what I'm saying.
But two things. If anybody will call you insane, I will be by your side, and I will have to call inside myself as well. And the second one, and to close this great exchange, is back to what you just said and the AI team members. So the AI team members will become a commodity.
Mhm.
So, what, in your opinion, will truly make the difference in 5 years' time when most of companies, hopefully, will have moved and made the best in the integration of these technologies?
So that's a really good question, and one that I come back to very often, because with any innovation spurt, there's that relatively limited amount of time where being a first mover or an early mover can really make a big difference for you commercially. But that time is fixed because eventually everybody else catches up. So, many years ago, I was leading the media and entertainment practice at SAS, which is an analytics provider, which was still a relatively early days of adoption of analytics across more traditional organizations. And so that was a very clear advantage for a limited amount of time. But then everybody else in your sector does the exact same thing because you're all looking at the same playbooks. Maybe they're not buying the exact same software that you are, but very similar functionality. And so everybody kind of levels up. But there's still a very, very strong human element in this that I think gets lost, because when we look at things like generative AI and AI team members, we start to think about all of the amount of work that's today kind of maybe busy work, or the kind of stuff that was inherently, the kind of skill that was inherently tied to the performance of our core business function. So, most of us spend a a big part of their day just writing emails. Someone writing emails for you sounds like a great value add, right? But you still have to figure out what should go in that email. So I think that puts much more value on people who can synthesize and connect different types of information to then have to, you don't necessarily have to do the processing yourself anymore, but somebody still has to tell an AI, hey, what if you combined, your a customer database with who opened the most recent email, and figured out some, propensity analysis or propensity to buy analysis from there. And that's the kind of stuff that machines aren't good at. They can mimic it, but it's not really driving a particular business outcome. And so I would selfishly like to think that in the next 5 years, we'll have removed a lot of the busy work today that is necessary to carry out our jobs, and that we'll actually be able to focus more on the interesting parts of our jobs. But who's to say that we just won't get replaced by AI bots? I'm actually working to replace myself. I've uploaded all of my writing and analysis that I've written over the years and similar into an LLM. And so now when I need to ask myself a question, I can query my own artificial intelligence, which is embarrassingly helpful, because when you write as much as I do, when you kind of your work is out there, it becomes very difficult to remember which point is you've made where. And so having something run across your own body of work is very, very beneficial. So
And
there.
what people don't know is that you suggested it to me, and I'm now in the same kind of situation. The level of knowledge of yourself that goes into that and comes out of it, and
And the next time we do this, these might just be two AIs talking to each other.
exactly,
looking at our entire body of work and having a
exactly.
chat probably about sports, because what else would we talk about?
Anna, thank you very much. This is exactly why I love talking to you. We could have gone on for 2 more hours, but I will keep it for 2 more episodes. Thank you very much.
Thank you.